Right now, there are anti-government protests taking place in more than 24 countries. Did you hear about the protests in Romania? How about the ones in Mexico? Okay, Iran. Germany? China? It's not easy keeping track of everything everywhere all at once, right? There are several factors, of course, that make something newsworthy, including journalists' judgment, your own news consumption habits, and those pesky algorithms. Plus, we know that there are tactics some governments use to try to suppress protest coverage or mislead audiences about the protesters' aims. In today's episode, I'm going to break down how all of those factors play into why one protest might absolutely flood your feeds and another might fail to make it onto your radar. While it's difficult for you or me to keep a finger on the pulse of all the protests happening worldwide on any given day, there are, luckily, some people doing that work for us. Like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which has a global protest tracker. You can scroll through their site and see where and why any government-related protest is happening, how long it's been running, and if it has led to any sort of reform or change. Researchers from the organization started the tracker after noticing an uptick in protest activity around 2010. Remember the Arab Spring and how often you saw coverage and conversations about it online and in the news? That was right at the start of this spike in protests in 2011, in the early days of social media. Now, other protests have certainly made it onto the news in the decade plus since then, but in the past 5 years alone, Carnegie's tracker has clocked more than 400 protests they've identified as significant. Clearly, not all of those got the prime time treatment. So let me peel back the curtain a bit and give you an insider lesson on what passes the news test to make it onto your TV. Each news program has a limited amount of time and a lot of choices to fill it. So when assessing a protest, producers are going to consider things like how many people are involved, what's at stake, has anyone been harmed or killed, or has there been any other sort of consequence, any damage or destruction, and is it actually influencing the actions of government officials? A producer is also going to be thinking about their viewers. First and foremost, is this protest directly impacting their audience? If not, they're going to consider whether their audience will easily understand what's going on in the protest, or if there are cultural, political, geographic, or linguistic barriers that might make it tough to sum up in the few minutes allotted for a news segment. Now, you might be thinking, well, I get most of my news from social media these days anyway, and while it might seem like that gives you unfettered access to all the news you could possibly imagine, there are still gatekeepers that exist, both human and machine. Last season, I brought on WNYC Radio's Kusha Navidar to introduce the concept of the filter bubble.
The filter bubble is kind of the universe of items that you see on the platforms where you go get your information or your content. All of these different signals that I give the platform, how much I'm watching, what I'm watching, all go into what it ends up giving to me.
Those filter bubbles are really examples of algorithms at work when it comes to seeing what you do. Think about the outlets you seek out and the sort of news you click on. If it's mostly reporting and stories from the US or other Western countries, that's going to mean you're less likely to stumble across a protest happening in, for example, a Middle Eastern country. We've got so-called newsworthiness, familiarity bias, and algorithms factoring into this so far, but we've still got more ground to cover, and I'm bringing in reinforcements. Meet Dr. Sanjana Hattutua. He is the Director of Research at the Disinformation Project in New Zealand and an expert on how social media and governments can shape and suppress protest narratives.
You've come across examples of social media, or at least more fundamentally the internet, democratizing access to information, creating opportunities for smaller voices to be heard. But we're also seeing that social media especially can be used as a tool for silencing dissent.
All the time, every time, everywhere. It's that simultaneous interplay between the silencing and the amplification. and sometimes silencing of democratic voices and the amplification of illiberal, authoritarian, autocratic voices because of the manner in which social media platforms are established and set up and architected and the algorithms run. That content, that narrative, that dissent never really gets on the news.
I wonder if, for our US audience, if you see any parallels, say, for example, with the Black Lives Matter protest movement or any of the others in the post-pandemic era that share any kind of tactical similarities with other international movements.
So what you saw with BLM and how they use tech, the hashtags, the use of Twitter, the adaptation, the adoption, the way that they were present on all the social media platforms, how it became inextricably entwined with the protest movement was very obvious for a very long time in other protest movements. It happened in Sri Lanka during the 2022 unprecedented, historic, what we call the Aragale. It's a word in Sinhalese which means struggle, but it made the global news headlines. And what you found was you used Google Maps, you used Twitter, you used satire, rap, art, protest art, poetry, output in every imaginable multimedia form. You used SMS, you used local radio stations that were then broadcasting over the internet. It was all done in this amazing manner to put out that story in a way that couldn't be censored easily. You had governments take up really popular hashtags and put their own content so that when you went onto the platform, it was really confusing as to what you were looking at. And that's really sophisticated stuff, right? I mean, you got it to trend and then you kind of diluted the message of the activists as well. Protest movements and activism is going to embrace the full spectrum of what is now available, from design tools through to voice generation, photography, and that full spectrum of what we are generally concerned about with generative AI, being harmful for democracy is also going to be very helpful, right? Because it's always a cat and mouse game. It's adoption by people who want it to be used for purposes of dissent and to avoid physical abuse that they might have to face as a consequence of putting their name out, their face out. And then also the authoritarian state-level grasp of these technologies for the purposes of autocratic fiat.
The truth is always important, of course, but when it comes to protests, there are often particularly high stakes. People's rights or lives might be on the line, so there's a lot to unpack around this topic for news reporters and news consumers alike. Outlets and journalists need to be thinking critically about what and who they are covering and why those are the subjects getting that precious limited airtime. And in the absence of real journalistic reporting on international protests, whether it's due to lack of coverage or government interference, it's easier for news consumers to fall victim to false narratives or misinformation. That means news consumers seeing protest footage shared on social media will want to be extra vigilant about checking who the source is and whether they are a trustworthy voice. Until next time, I'm Hari Srinivasan, and this is Take on Fake. Thanks for watching.